The truth is, there's a monumental battle stirring beneath the waves of our oceans, with deep-sea creatures on one side, and bizarrely enough, with modern technology on the other. And most people don't even know it's happening.
From 2030, the sale of new diesel-only and petrol-only cars will be banned. That's a decade earlier than originally planned.
And by that time, it's estimated that the number of electric vehicles on our roads will have increased from about 12 million today to over 150 million.
The future is electric.
But with all those battery packs and electronics needing cobalt, nickel, copper, and manganese, demand for these metals is exploding, and manufacturers might not be able to keep up the pace of production.
Average annual cobalt price is more than doubled.
Well, demand for copper has dramatically increased.
Price of nickel ore has surged.
Which is perhaps why it's not surprising that companies such as Tesla are beginning to foray further up their supply chains. A move which is, well, problematic, given how environmentally destructive these mines are, how many of them are concentrated in geopolitical hotspots, and how some are actively engaged in human rights abuses.
Child labour and dangerous mining practices are commonplace in what the industry disingenuously terms artisanal mining.
And this problem is not limited to the EV industry. It applies to aerospace, semiconductor, smartphone, wind, solar, and vast other industries and technologies, many of which are going to be crucial in allowing us any sort of chance to transition towards a green future.
I think a lot of people look at green technology as a potential savior.
And so as the raw materials needed for manufacturing these technologies become increasingly strained, attention has begun to shift towards the seafloor.
The only other major untapped cobalt resources are under the ocean.
There are literally trillions of these nodules on the deep seabed.
This is where many companies and their host countries have begun to jostle for prime position in the hope of securing and mining these deep-sea deposits, but much to the alarm of many scientists.
And so we were faced with the prospect of big industry going in and churning up the bottom of the ocean.
And so once again, the forces of conservation are coming up against those of exploitation. But this time, everyone claims to be doing it to save the Earth.
And we can reduce CO2 emissions by more than 90%.
And so in this video, we're going to explore the history of deep-sea mining and find out why it didn't work out in the past. We'll hear from one of the foremost marine geochemists on what exactly these deposits are, why they're so important, and why they might not be so easy to extract. We'll find out what role the rise of China plays in all this, but most importantly, we'll try to answer the difficult question of, will we have to sacrifice the deep sea in order to save the rest of the Earth? It's not as clear-cut as you might think. This is the battle for Clarion's Deep. So, scattered across the vast plains of the ocean floor are trillions of potato-sized nodules that are stirring a great battle beneath the waves. Though they were first discovered towards the end of the 20th century, interest in them only really developed after John L. Merrill's 1965 book, The Mineral Resources of the Sea, which painted them as an easy-to-harvest and virtually inexhaustible resource. And this led to a number of the world's most industrialized nations rushing to compete for domination of these metallic potato fields. A battle and competition which, well, didn't last very long. But before we ask ourselves why this initial interest in deep-sea mining subsequently died down, I had to ask Professor Andrea Koschinksy, what exactly are these deposits? How are they formed and what makes them so special?
Yeah. Ferromanganese nodules are small potato-shaped, potato-sized concretions, which we find on the sediment in about 4,000 or 5,000 meter water depth of the abyssal plains of the deep oceans. Basically everywhere in the global oceans where we find these plains, so we have basically the sediment surface, and these nodules lie on top of the sediment, partly within the sediment and partly sticking out. This is important because it refers to how they form. They form by precipitating metals out of the water column very slowly over millions of years, and these metals accumulate around a little nucleus that is in the sediment. That can be a little pebble, that can be a shark tooth or something like that. And with time, one layer after the other of manganese and iron oxides accumulates and the nodule starts growing, so that within a few millions of years it gets about like the size of this or that. And what is interesting about them is that it's not only manganese and iron, which is economically not that exciting, but during this growth process, a lot of other precious metals accumulate, like cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, rare earth elements, platinum. A lot of what we need today for a lot of modern technologies. And considering that amount of nodules that lies on the seafloor is really vast, of course, there's also a big resource potential at the seafloor.
So if the resource potential of these nodules was already understood back in the 60s and the 70s, then for what reason did this initial interest subsequently die down? Louisa?
At the time, there was a big demand for metals, and there were a lot of fears about potential supply shortages.
The space race was all the rage during the 60s and 70s as the United States and Soviet Union fought a technological battle for dominance. Such was the degree of high modernism at the time.
High modernism, the unwavering belief in science and technology to overcome and reshape anything to suit human needs.
That many people believed it was only a matter of a decade or so before humans would conquer space and start living on Mars.
The idea of putting large colonies in space.
The huge space colony could be built before the year 2000.
And so given this background, scooping up nodules from the ocean floor didn't seem particularly difficult. Moreover, the late 60s and early 70s saw a number of newly independent countries from the global south begin to gain control of their natural resources and use them to exert influence on their more industrialized, often former colonial counterparts.
For the first time, the developing countries of the world are flexing their muscles at the rich industrialized nations, wielding what they hope will be a new economic weapon: commodity power.
This gave rise to commodity cartels such as OPEC and CPEC, which began to use boycotts to control the price of oil, metals, and other crucial commodities as leverage. Predictably, this unnerved most industrialized countries and further ruffled the already jittery commodity markets, rising inflation, and flagging international trade.
Industrial production has been stagnant for the last 12 months, and the hoped-for recovery of the international economy, which looked like taking off in the middle of 1976, has not been sustained.
And so it is within this context that John L. Merrill's book appeared to offer industrialized nations a reasonable solution with which to bypass and counteract some of the growing influence of developing countries. The lines had been drawn, and the stage for deep-sea mining had been set. But, as it turned out, the influence of these commodity cartels and their ability to coordinate had been vastly overstated, amongst other things. And so as market nerves eased and other terrestrial mines ramped up production, metal prices stabilized. And that, combined with a really humbling realization of just how difficult and expensive it actually is to scoop black potatoes from the ocean floor.
You just have to harvest them, but that's tougher than it sounds.
Effectively reduced the first wave of interest in deep-sea mining to a whimper. But Sparrenberg, in his account of the history of deep-sea mining, also stated that
when this history is considered, one might say that deep-sea mining has merely reached a point where it already was at the end of the 1970s.
So what exactly brings us back here?
The metal resource scarcity that we have seen in the past 10 years is the driving factor. For a CO2 neutral economy, we need renewable energies. But no matter whether it's wind power or solar power, electrical cars, etc., they all need very special metals like rare earth elements, like platinum, like cobalt, etc.
And when it comes to cobalt and rare earths, they're effectively the preserve of the Democratic Republic of Congo and China respectively. This is because the DRC produces approximately 70% of the world's cobalt, which is crucial in the production of superalloys, the refinement of crude oil, and the production of lithium-ion batteries. But about a fifth of this cobalt comes from small-scale subsistence mining, which is highly dangerous, ignores most environmental concerns, and also often involves the use of child, forced, and exploitative labor. But the large mechanized industrial mines, mostly run by foreign companies, might actually be worse.
No fish here. No fish. There is nothing here. Why? Because the river has been polluted.
The scientists took samples from the parents of Mutombo and Kayembe. The results showed that they had 4 times as much cobalt in their blood as the highest values normally observed in people living in Western Europe.
The smartphone or laptop on which you're watching this video and on which I am making it almost certainly contains cobalt from these operations. And so the increasing demand for electrification and battery technologies has a very different meaning for the people, animals, and environment in these communities. But now, some of them are starting to fight back.
Now Congolese families want to hold Apple, Google, Dell, Tesla, and Microsoft accountable. It's the first time the tech industry has faced legal action over the mining of cobalt.
China, on the other hand, was producing almost 98% of the world's rare earths in the year 2010. And interestingly enough, it was around this time that Beijing decided to restrict exports of their rare earth minerals, primarily citing environmental concerns. Now, rare earths have an astounding range of uses, but they are absolutely crucial to 3 key industries: electronics, renewables, and defense.
The F-35 fighter jet is the most technologically advanced weapon system in history. Each one contains nearly a half a ton of what's called rare earth elements, almost all of which come from China.
3 industries of great geopolitical importance going forward. As such, the export restrictions on these crucial rare earth minerals were met with heavy criticism from Western countries, but Beijing remained defiant, prompting the United States, the EU, and Japan to escalate the situation.
The US and several of its allies have filed complaints against China with the World Trade Organization,
arguing that the restrictions on rare earth exports violated international trade rules.
Being able to manufacture advanced batteries and hybrid cars in America is too important for us to stand by and do nothing.
And even though China went on to lose the case, and even though rare earth mines outside of China used the incident to raise capital and to ramp up production, China to this day largely remains defiant on the issue and has even gone on to increase its influence on the Congolese cobalt supply chain, which is in effect the global cobalt supply chain. Predictably, this has unnerved many Western countries who now wish to find a more long-term solution with which to bypass and counteract this growing influence. Now throw in today's Silicon Valley-inspired high modernist thinking, which believes that tech can solve any and all problems, and it all starts to feel very familiar, doesn't it?
Elon Musk wants to put his first human colony on Mars sometime in 2022.
So once again, the lines have been drawn, the stage has been set, and the world is looking once more to the oceans for a solution. Enter Clarion's Deep. The deep sea is a dark and foreboding place, under crushing pressures and freezing temperatures. And with an average depth of almost 4 kilometers, this alien world is the Earth's last frontier, largely unconquered and unspoiled by humankind. But because the vast majority of the deep sea lies outside of the jurisdiction of any one country, the prospect of deep sea mining prompted the United Nations to establish the International Seabed
Authority to ensure that it's not just very rich industrialized countries that have the capacity to exploit the resources that are located there, but that instead it should be done in a way that benefits mankind as a whole.
As such, the International Seabed Authority regulates and controls all mineral-related activities in these international waters, including the issuing of 19 contracts that are currently in existence for nodule exploration, 17 of which focus on a piece of the North Pacific, 5,000 kilometers across, at depths of between 4 and 5,500 meters, the Clarion Clipperton zone. With an estimated nodule density of 15 kilograms per square meter, the cobalt, nickel, thallium, and beryllium in this region alone could suffice to fuel the transition to green technologies and industries for decades to come.
This is like a battery in a rock.
But however dark and desolate these depths might seem, they're actually teeming with life.
that this is the first time a fish in this family has ever been seen alive.
It's amazing how little we know about the ocean.
The biomass of the animals is very low, but the diversity is very high.
Almost every time we go in the deep ocean, we find new species.
This remote and alien world is home to a surprisingly wide variety of species, many of them newly discovered, and all interconnected through complex ecosystems that scientists have only just begun to discover and explore. And so the battle we have on our hands, the battle for Clarion's deep, is between these soft, fragile creatures on one side, and bizarrely enough, our smartphones, laptops, EVs, wind turbines, and all aspects of modern life on the other. For the first time, we're effectively having to confront the price of our consumerism before we pay it, and having to face up to the death and destruction we're about to inflict, because...
That's what it is. Mining is a polite word. And mining also means destruction, and destruction of an ecosystem of which we know pathetically little.
But proponents of deep-sea mining like Gerard Barron, the CEO of the metals company, insist that in the grander context, mining the deep sea is not such a bad thing because...
If we had our time again, we'd carry out extractive industries in parts of the planet where there was the least life. That's what we're dealing with here in the abyssal zone. It's the world's biggest desert. It just happens to be covered by 4,000 meters of water.
Well, luckily for us, the interest in deep-sea mining has resulted in more funding being made available for exploration and study of the deep sea. And even though we're still in the infancy of most of these studies, there's quite a lot we can already observe and infer. Like for instance, in 1989, when a group of German scientists decided to run a little experiment. They went to the Peru Basin, home to the second largest known manganese nodule deposits, and picked an 11 square kilometer area covered in nodules about 4,000 meters deep. This little area, dark and desert-like though it seemed, turned out to have a surprisingly wide variety of life. There were suspension feeders like sponges, tube-dwelling anemones, and sea lilies, all which feed by anchoring themselves to the nodules, then stretching themselves out and filtering out small particles of dead organic matter from the water. There were deposit feeders like brittle stars and sea cucumbers that move along the soft sediment like squishy little vacuum cleaners, sucking up the sediment and assimilating any organic matter present. There were also predators that prey on other bottom-dwelling animals, like the strange-looking abyssal grenadier, and scavengers like deep-sea snails and crabs that feed on the carcasses and scrapes that remain. And it is upon this small 11 square kilometer nodule field that the scientists lowered a harrow plow and dragged it along 20% of the area to mimic deep-sea mining. And in 2015, 26 years later, the scientists returned to observe the area. This is a graph of life on undisturbed seafloor within the area. This is a graph of life on seafloor adjacent to the disturbed area. And this is a graph of life on the disturbed seafloor 26 years later. The suspension feeders that attach to the nodules don't stand a chance. And while the deposit feeders, predators and scavengers are able to move out of the way, they no longer have the shelter and protection that the suspension feeders often provide them. And these more mobile fauna will nevertheless be unable to escape the large plumes of sediment kicked up by the nodule collectors.
This deep-sea clay forms a suspension for quite some time.
Plumes which can drift far beyond the mine site, affecting seafloor and water column ecosystems all along the way.
And of course, if you have to clean the nodules from the sediment that sticks to the nodules, of course, you produce more sediment that has to be deposited somewhere.
And that somewhere is likely to be much higher up in the water column, a grave cause for concern.
Because the water column is even more problematic because here, especially in the upper photic layer, you have the highest bioproductivity.
And this is not to mention the noise that the nodule collectors will make.
Pumps are located every kilometer and will generate noise.
Noise which travels well through water, affecting an important part of how these fragile deep-sea animals communicate and detect prey. There will be light pollution, the release of toxic metals into the water, the altering of geochemical balances and cycles that last millions of years, and possible effects on important services that the deep sea provides, like
it locks up carbon, which mitigates climate change. It absorbs heat. It recycles nutrients, which support our fisheries. And it's these other types of service that we get from the deep sea that we don't even think about.
And so, given how gloomy this outlook is, the question therefore becomes, why is the march towards deep sea mining speeding up? Why are its patrons and prophets preaching salvation through it? Let's look through the main arguments. I think the last one will surprise you.
The risks are great, but the rewards could be greater.
The price of nickel ore has surged.
Well, demand for copper has dramatically increased.
Cobalt prices more than doubled in 2017
due to
the
in the world. There are a ton of critical metals in the deep sea. There's simply more manganese, nickel, cobalt, thallium, and beryllium in the CCZ alone than in their entire terrestrial reserves, ensuring enough supply for incoming demand for electrification, battery, and renewable technologies. Secondly,
for every 5 grams, there's 999,995 grams of tail.
Cubic meters of wastewater poured into local water
system, no buildings, no other facilities. It's all done from a ship.
A lot of infrastructure that characterizes terrestrial mining is simply not needed for deep-sea mining operations. There is no need for roads, buildings, waste dumps, no relocation of towns and villages, deforestation or large-scale lowering of the groundwater, and no need to remove any overburden since the nodules lie on or just below the ocean floor. Thirdly,
it's crawling with children, working like modern-day slaves.
That Bolsonaro is trying to expropriate ancestral lands for his money.
There are likely to be fewer social impacts on human populations. There will likely be no displacement of indigenous populations, no forced labor, child labor, or the kind of human rights abuses currently being observed in the cobalt supply chain.
Because deep-sea mining requires a highly skilled workforce.
Fourth,
the U.S. and several of its allies have filed complaints against China.
Dominance of the market enables it to control prices.
Seabeds are designated as the common heritage of all mankind.
The International Seabed Authority is guided by the principle that deep-sea deposits in the open ocean are the common heritage of all humankind. And so with deep-sea mining under these guidelines, we are less likely to see the kinds of resource monopolies and bottlenecks that tend to cause geopolitical conflict. Note, I said less likely. But moving on, fifth.
They face social, developmental, and environmental challenges stemming from, yes, their size, but also their geographical positioning and low-lying nature.
Small island nations primarily depend on fishing and tourism to sustain their economies, but with declining fish stocks and a global pandemic that has forced visitors to stay at home, the situation is dire. However, mining the deep sea offers them an opportunity to diversify and grow their economies, and perhaps even fund the infrastructure and protections they will have to build against the rising seas and changing climate. And lastly, sixth. CO2 emissions for deep sea mining operations just might be lower, much lower, than those of terrestrial mines.
We can make battery cathodes using our rocks compared to using land-based mining material, and we can reduce CO2 emissions by more than 90%.
In essence, it's simply more efficient to mine just one deep-sea deposit to get 3 or 4 different metals, whereas 3 or 4 separate operations would be needed to achieve the same on land. However, look at the variation between the bars in this graph. Each one represents the heavy fuel oil consumption of one of 3 different methods of deep-sea mining in some stage of consideration or development. What this and other similar graphs show is that current estimations of the emissions, fuel consumption, and pollution of a potential commercial nodule mine vary quite widely, and the concepts with the least emissions might not be the most technologically or economically feasible ones. And even then, there's still a lot of unknown variables, or unknown unknowns, that will likely add to the emissions, indicating that the prognosis of lower emissions could turn out to be inaccurate, or the difference might not be large enough to justify the potential harm. Moreover, these estimates fail to include the substantial costs and emissions of monitoring, reporting, and trying to prevent the impacts of the mining activity. Because once something has already gone wrong, we simply have no efficient system with which to restore, repair, or rehabilitate life on the seafloor, 4,000 meters below the surface. I mean, look at how badly we deal with accidents that take place close to the surface, where it's infinitely easier to do anything.
Mayday! Explosion and fire on the Piper platform. All personnel abandoned.
It was gut-wrenching to go down there and see just nothing on the seafloor.
The dispersants used to clean up the disaster left behind invisible toxic chemicals
which are killing people.
And these deep-sea ecosystems are turning out to be much more interconnected with each other and with the rest of the ocean than we ever thought before.
This is a huge system, the deep sea floor. And so the total amount of individual organisms that live there in a very connected way of habitats is much larger than people may think. This is definitely not a desert.
Which means that mining one field can have far-reaching consequences, both in 3D space and in time. A bad picture indeed, but one that gets worse when you start to consider how expensive and difficult deep-sea mining actually is.
You have to work in 1,000 to 4,000 meter water depth. So with an enormous pressure, you need very long cables. You need a surface ship, and that needs to be connected to the mining equipment on the seafloor. And of course, seawater is a quite aggressive corrosive solution.
And so economies of scale will be crucial in giving the operations any reasonable chance of being economically viable, which quintessentially means that for deep-sea mining to make commercial sense, very large areas will have to be mined. But most of the potential advantages of deep-sea mining hinge on one very large assumption.
Deep-sea mining could avoid many problems that we see in land mining. But of course, that would only work if land mining can slowly be reduced when deep-sea mining increases.
Because however efficient deep-sea mining might turn out to be, it will simply be adding to the environmental damage and emissions of terrestrial mines.
This idea would only function if both resource extractions would be considered in the context and somehow also managed in the context, which may be quite difficult because land mines are often, they belong to the nations. And how to regulate them globally will be very difficult.
And of course, there is no indication that land-based mines for critical metals will close.
I don't think it's an either-or decision, but it will happen in addition to it mostly. Because overall the demand for metals is rising.
They will most likely expand and compete, which offers no relief whatsoever for the affected ecosystems and communities like Kolwezi in the DRC.
They had 4 times as much cobalt in their blood as the highest values normally observed in people living in Western Europe.
And unfortunately, the outlook for communities in the small Pacific islands is not much better.
It is possible that the big companies exploit these developing countries. I mean, after all, there is a reason that the metals company, for example, or generally big companies are aligning with developing states. However, both parties want something out of it.
The islands do not have the resources or technology needed to explore the deep sea, let alone to mine it. Deep-sea mining companies, on the other hand, are developing the technology but are unable to get exploration or mining licenses without being sponsored by a country that is signatory to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. As such, deep-sea mining companies are partnering up with these small island nations.
They usually form a subsidiary company that is a national of the country.
But as a Greenpeace report published in late 2020 found, the leading proponents for deep-sea mining in the region are corporate entities that are geographically, politically and economically removed from the small island nations that will bear the brunt of the consequences.
Many of the more traditional people are a bit scared that they would potentially not be able to profit from the income but would be left behind with any damage and harm that would arise from the deep-sea mining.
These corporate entities are significantly more likely to underestimate and overlook the potential risks because they have limited exposure.
You make the upside, and when you're wrong, who pays for the losses?
So what does this all mean? What is the way forward? Is there a way forward? Should there be a way forward? Or are we just going to push forward regardless, Move fast and break things?
What we are asking is that we should not go in and trash an area of the globe about which we know hardly anything until we've done the proper research. In short, we want a moratorium against action of industrializing and mining the deep sea.
Yeah, well, we would need more time, of course. But we will never reach the point where we will fully understand the system. The more time passes, the more expensive everything will be, the more critical the resource scarcity may become. So this has all to be balanced out.
Which is why Koschinksy and friends have written that despite doubtless environmental impacts, deep-sea mining may turn out to be a favorable alternative to terrestrial mining. Nevertheless, this statement is conditioned on effective and efficient regulatory systems being in place.
We need a very strict environmental, legislative framework.
Which might be why companies such as Google, BMW, Volvo and Samsung have vowed not to buy any critical metals sourced from the deep sea before the potential impacts are assessed, informed regulation is drawn, and necessary protections have been put in place.
There are a lot of science gaps that need to be filled, and until these questions can be answered, we refrain from using those minerals for our vehicles.
And if I'm to take these companies' words at face value, then I agree. The last thing we need to do is to destroy an important part of the earth under the pretense that we're creating green technology to save that very earth from ourselves and our own activities.
There's alignment on the need to go as fast as we can with low carbon infrastructure to beat climate change, and electrification will play a big part in that. But the idea that we need to mine the oceans in order to do that is, I think, a very false dichotomy.
Because alternatives do exist, but they aren't nearly getting the attention and resources that they need. From cobalt-free batteries and large-scale recycling to enforcement of environmental regulations and protections, measures against planned obsolescence, and perhaps even rethinking how most of society's activities are now structured and valued based on their potential contribution to economic growth or lack thereof. And this can be observed in how the primary push for deep-sea mining isn't actually environmental, though the messaging is.
And we can reduce CO2 emissions by more than 90%.
The main push instead comes from potential economic gains and geopolitical maneuvering,
China's dominance of the market,
while co-opting people who do actually care for the environment by use of this false dichotomy to greenwash the entire endeavor.
This is why we're here.
Polymetallic nodules.
Because this little
black
rock sells for
$500 a ton.
That's the only reason. It's what pays for the whole party. It's what pays for your science.
At the same time, bribing and silencing the voices of those most likely to bear the brunt of the consequences. I'm sorry, I've seen this story before. You and I both can already predict how this ends and who the winners and the losers are likely going to be. Which is why I think that the battle for Clarion's Deep is not so much a battle between industry and academia, technologists and scientists, and neither is it really a battle between deep-sea ecosystems and modern technological ecosystems. I think that in its essence, it is a battle for our souls on whether or not we're willing to once again rush in and destroy for economic gain, and in order to continue to indulge the excesses that brought us here in the first place. I think that at its core would be a Faustian bargain, and the last thing we need to do is to forget the lesson of Nauru and the Faustian bargain that it made with the UK, Australia and New Zealand. Let's end this with a story. According to Carl McDaniel's book, Paradise for Sale, a piece of rock from the tiny mid-Pacific island of Nauru found its way to the offices of the Pacific Islands Company in Sydney, Australia in 1896. And for 3 years, the rock served as a doorstop. That was until it caught the eye of Albert Fuller Ellis, a prospector for the company, who on a hunch decided to test it.
Phosphate was discovered here at the turn of the century. It is the only economic resource of the island, and from it stem the improved living standards enjoyed by the Nauruan community today.
And for most of the first 2/3 of the 20th century, Australia and New Zealand, with the permission of the UK, plundered the Nauruan landscape for phosphate. with more than 80% of it ending up in the fields and paddocks of the antipodes.
Without access to phosphate, neither Australia nor New Zealand would have been able to establish the industrial agricultural systems that were fundamental to their demographic, economic, and social expansion.
However, in 1968, the Nauruans gained independence, and in 1970, they took over the phosphate operations, but they continued to mine the island in return for royalties and riches.
Back on the island, owners of land being mined got used to annual royalties, which in the beginning were substantial.
And indeed, when phosphate prices shot up during the commodity scare of the 70s, the GDP per capita of the Nauruans topped $25,000. That's over $100,000 today when adjusted for inflation. All was well in paradise. Until
I think this economy is going to collapse completely, if it hasn't collapsed already.
By the mid-2000s, the phosphate deposits had been exhausted, the money was gone, and all that remained was a wasteland walked by giants.
A small island, but her people are big, very big. Nauru is the fattest country on Earth.
Nauru has an obesity crisis, which in large part is due to the import and consumption of cheap processed foods, which ironically come from the thriving farmlands of Australia and New Zealand. Something that Nauru has to do because its own farmlands were lost to decades of phosphate mining. This story reads like a Greek tragedy, a cautionary tale, a warning to us all about the dangers of greed, of failing to strike a balance between exploitation and conservation, and the potential curse of the black potato. Surely a warning that Nauru and the rest of us have taken to heart. Right?
A small Pacific nation has given the International Seabed Authority a 2-year deadline to finalize the rules for mining in the deep sea.
By triggering the 2-year clause, Nauru has set the stage for deep sea mining to begin as early as 2023.